All right. Good evening. It is 7 o'clock Mountain Time, so we'll go ahead and get started. Before I move into any new material, were there any questions that arose on the basis of last week's class that anyone was interested in addressing before we move on? All right. So, at the very beginning of today's class, I mentioned last week that very briefly that we would talk just a little bit about since Ling is a traditional Tibetan Buddhist center, and broadly speaking, what we do is present people with the path to enlightenment. That at least briefly, of course, a person doesn't have to use anything in this class or use their meditation practice broadly to accomplish that goal, but to just give a little bit of context for a couple of minutes about how Buddhism understands traditional meditation practices and the sort of the purpose of traditional goals of meditation. Then, we'll talk a little bit about that. So, the goal as a Tibetan Buddhist center, I mentioned this idea of the path to enlightenment. What that essentially means, we've all heard of the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, and everything that everything that became known as Buddhism were the direct teachings, the direct insights of Shakyamuni Buddha. And ultimately, the path of mental development that he laid out had as its goal to become Buddhas ourselves, to engage in this process of inner development that has as its ultimate goal becoming a Buddha oneself. And a Buddha, the word Buddha, means if we look at the Tibetan word for Buddha, it is Sangye, Sanggya, and those are two syllables, and they mean fully developed and they mean fully purified. So, and they refer to the mind of that particular kind of being. So the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, had a mind that was both fully developed and fully purified. So when we say fully purified, of course, that in English, that kind of sounds a bit intense. But what we would say is that right now, as an ordinary sentient being, we find ourselves under the influence of states of mind that are not the best, right? We find ourselves sometimes, feeling quite a lot of malice towards some sentient beings. We find ourselves under the influence of strong attachment to things that we enjoy. We find ourselves under the influence of strong aversion to things that we find unpleasant. And these are all really unpeaceful states of mind when there's jealousy, when there's hatred, when there's grasping at that which we find pleasant, when there's strong aversion to that which we find unpleasant. Our mind itself is unpeaceful. And often when we engage in actions of body, speech, or mind, that are colored by those states of mind with other people, then we say and do things that, that are not the most loving, compassionate, kind, generous, open ways of relating to others when those states of mind are operative in the mind. So in Buddhism, they would call all of those states of mind obscurations. And So, fully purified means having a mind that's free from hatred, a mind that's free from jealousy, strong attachment, strong aversion, a mind that's very open, very engaged, very in tune with the way that things are without those exaggerated states of mind that are unpeaceful for oneself and that often motivate actions that are not truly beneficial for others. And then fully developed means that all of the constructive or positive states of mind, like loving kindness, generosity, compassion, those are developed limitlessly because the mind will go into talking now also about the nature of mind, because meditation is about the mind, and the nature of mind itself is a non-physical energy that is able to generate understanding or awareness. And that, as a non-physical energy, it is different than the continuity of the physical body. The physical body, no matter how well you eat, no matter how much you exercise, the physical body is going to, over time, decline as we get older and older, and the physical body will end, this particular physical body will end in death, right? No matter what we do, no matter how well we take care of it. But the mind, being a separate continuity that's non-physical, being an energetic continuity, the mind isn't constrained in the same way. The body is constrained by its physicality, but the mind is not. So these constructive states of mind can be pursued and cultivated without any limit. And that's the second quality of the mind of an enlightened being, fully purified of the obscurations and then fully developed of all of these beneficial, constructive, useful states of mind, those that support internal contentment, joy, peace, and those that, when they are operative, um, lead to actions of body, speech, and mind that benefit others naturally. We know that when we ourselves are in a state of kindness, generosity, compassion, to whatever degree we've been able to develop it presently, then the things that we say, the things that we do are much more likely to be useful to those around us. Whereas when we're feeling malice, when we're feeling jealous, when we're feeling, these not so beneficial states of mind, the words that we say, the things that we do are more likely to cause difficulty in our relationships, to be, um, difficult for the people around us. So, and this is basically not, it's not a question of kind, it's really a question of degree. We presently have a certain amount of loving kindness, generosity, compassion, and so on. And it's just a question of how further, developed these become over time. A Buddha is simply a different kind of being that's fully developed these qualities. And we certainly, right now, we have a certain amount of control over our malice, over our jealousy, over these not so constructive states of mind. And a Buddha is simply a being that doesn't struggle with that at all, that is fully capable of not acting out of these states of mind. So really the only distinction between us as an ordinary sentient being and a Buddha is time and energy and effort in pursuing this path of training that the Buddha used his entire life, after showing the aspect of achieving what I referred to as enlightenment, um, in giving us a reliable path of mental training. And this is what ultimately, this is what the center in all of its classes is trying to communicate, is how do we engage in that path of training. But like I said, that's just kind of an advertisement for this deeper work that meditation can be used for, and really is the purpose of how the Buddha presented meditation. But a person's meditation practice is their own, and there's no right or wrong way to engage in that, and a person certainly isn't obligated to decide that they're interested in that path now or ever, but just to know that meditation is also the main vehicle, that when if a person chooses, meditation is the main vehicle for transforming the mind, not just in these more conventional ways of becoming a little bit more kind or a little bit more patient, but that the mind as a non-physical energy has this incredible potential that really isn't part of our culture. In the Western culture, it's not posited as the nature of our own mind. But the Buddha would say, well, that is the nature of your own mind, because your own mind isn't, as I said, it's not different in kind from the mind of a Buddha. The mind of a Buddha is a non-physical energy that's capable of knowing, and our mind is a non-physical energy that's capable of knowing. A Buddha simply has already done this path of training, and our mind hasn't. We've not yet done that path of training. We've not yet completed that path of training. So if you want to, it is something that is possible to engage in. And the class, as I mentioned, next month, in January, we're offering Introduction to Mindfulness. That's not so much a class that goes into that philosophical structure, but then in February, we do have two workshops on the 7th and the 14th. Those are going to be Saturday workshops, and those will be on Buddhism in a nutshell. And that's going to give you more so of that philosophical framework. And again, that'll be available on Zoom and on YouTube if you're not able to make it. Okay. Did that generate any thoughts or questions for anyone? All right. So let's take another opportunity to engage in a little bit of practice. We did last in the first class, we worked with breathing meditation and the bare awareness meditation, which showed us these two skills of concentration and introspection. But now we'll do a meditation called Mind Like the Sky. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the posture of meditation. If you're new, then just try to sit comfortably with an upright spine, feet flat, back straight, hands in the lap, right over left, with the palms upturned and the thumbs gently touching or resting on your knees. Eyes are gently closed or slightly open, whatever is going to allow you to have enough light to remain alert. And then begin to move your awareness inward, letting go of thoughts of the past, plans for the future, letting go too of attending to whatever's happening in your environment. allowing sights and sounds to be as they are. No need to investigate, constraining your awareness just to the body and mind. Then begin to concentrate your awareness in the present by attending closely to the physical sensation that accompanies the in breath and the out breath in the space around the opening of the nostrils, breathing naturally, breathing normally, and just noticing whatever sensations naturally arise on the in breath and the out breath, giving yourself the instruction to notice quickly when anything other than that one physical sensation is arising in the mind, and then, without judgment, without frustration, lifting your awareness up from those distractions and placing it gently but firmly again and again on the breath. And then begin to turn your awareness to the mind, thinking of the stage of the mind itself like the sky, thinking of it as a great expanse of clear blue sky. And as you notice thoughts or feelings, memories that arise in the mind, think of them like clouds. Clouds that arise and abide and dissolve back into the expanse of sky. So try not to energize or follow any particular object of awareness. Just noticing as each one arises in that stage of the mind. Recognizing that the space-like nature of the mind is what allows each thought, each feeling, each memory to exist within it. To try to allow the arising of these objects of awareness to remind you to infer the existence of the sky or space like nature of the mind. And over time, try to identify more with that sky, space like nature, and not the individual objects, the cloud like individual objects that arise and abide and dissolve within the stage of the mind. And just silently for a couple of minutes, observe the mind in this way. And then when you're ready, we'll come back together. All right. So, with a meditation like that, we are practicing seeing ourselves as the observer of our mental states. And as we practice a meditation like that over time, then we begin to see um, different things. One thing that we begin to see is how our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions influence, our choices, our behaviors. We begin to develop an internal wisdom about, when certain mental states are arising and how they impact the decisions that we make, the things that we say, the things that we do. And also, we begin to empower ourselves to understand that the things that are arising in the stage of the mind don't have as much power as they used to have. We begin to understand them, not as these monolithic experiences that we have no choice in, that we have no control over. But we begin to see them just as thoughts, as feelings, as things that we can choose not to create larger stories around, to not energize. We can say, oh, I've got, an angry thought arising in this stage of my mind. I have a jealous thought arising within the stage of my mind, but I can see that as, as the observer, I can see that as something that I can just allow to dissolve back into the mind itself. I don't have to add additional thoughts, additional stories. I don't have to follow that angry thought with how dare that person do that thing, and they deserve whatever I may be planning to do to them later on today. I can just see it as this bubble that's arising in the stage of the mind, and I can allow that to dissipate on its own. So it really gives us an empowering perspective to recognize, of course, how we are influenced by what is happening in the mind itself, but then also it can give us a sense of freedom to choose what to do when we develop this wisdom of not just getting carried away by what's happening in the mind, but by seeing it as these moments of mind and then making decisions with wisdom, with introspective awareness, decisions on what to actually do, how to um, divert or change what's happening in the mind, to apply. In Buddhism, they would call that applying some sort of antidote, right? We see anger arising in the mind. We recognize that malice, that angry thought is causing suffering in the mind itself, and it's also likely to lead to an unkind word, to some sort of destructive bodily action, raising our voice in anger, perhaps trying to wound others with our speech out of the arising of that state of mind. And then with the freedom to recognize that that's bubbling up in the mind, we can begin to react in a different way that cuts off that chain of mental events, that chain of thoughts as it's arising. And of course, this takes time, but as we begin to practice this kind of mind as the observer meditation, we can see how we really have the ability to to not be at the mercy of what's arising in the mind, but instead do something constructive with what we notice is arising in the mind. So, did that generate any thoughts or questions that anyone might like to address? All right. So now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about uh, types of meditation that we might include in our daily practice. There's two main divisions, two broad divisions of meditation. We've defined meditation in the first class as becoming familiar with a virtuous object. So, the first kind of meditation, I think I might have used the phrase, is analytical meditation. And then the second is stabilizing meditation. Those are the two largest divisions or categories of meditation, particularly as a Tibetan Buddhist center, what we really focus on. So, a stabilizing meditation is something that is connected with concentration. And it a stabilizing meditation doesn't depend upon active contemplation. It doesn't depend upon the use of thoughts or words or ideas. So, for example, a breathing meditation would be an example of a purely stabilizing meditation because the breathing meditation is really a meditation on bodily sensation, right? It's the physical sensation that accompanies the in breath and the out breath. So you're generating a physical sensation and you're just holding your mind on that physical sensation. Um, Whereas an analytical meditation does depend upon the use of thoughts, the use of concepts, the use of language to generate your object of meditation. So if we meditated on uh, love, for example, we would that would be an analytical meditation because it would require the use of thoughts, concepts, language in order to develop that. So um, we might think of someone for whom we have love for, someone in our lives, a friend, a family member, and we might imagine that that person is in front of us, and we might think of how we regard them, how we think of them as someone that we naturally, spontaneously wish for their happiness. We wish them to be free of suffering. We wish them to have all of the conditions, the inner and outer conditions that they wish to have. And that from the Buddhist perspective, that is love, wishing them happiness, wishing them to have all of the necessary inner and outer conditions that support them in beneficial ways. And that generates that state of mind in our own mind, right? We use that person as an entryway into the experience of love. And then we would try to generalize that state of mind to others, right? We would try to broaden and deepen our experience of love by then subsequently bringing to mind a different person, someone that we don't know, someone that we saw earlier that day. And, because they're for us a stranger, we don't naturally, it's not typical that we would naturally imagine that this person that we saw on the bus or that we saw in the grocery store, we wouldn't have naturally, spontaneously, it's logical, it's reasonable that we wouldn't have the same depth of naturally, spontaneously wishing for them to be free of suffering, to have the necessary internal and external beneficial conditions in the same way that our brother, our sister, our mother, our father, our husband, our wife, our child, it's reasonable that we don't relate to them in the same way. But if we take as our goal the broadening and the deepening of loving kindness, compassion, then we would use them as a stand-in for just ordinary sentient beings that populate our world. And we would imagine that now they are in front of us. And we would recollect, what did it feel like when I had loving kindness and compassion for my dear friend? What were the words that I used? What was the state of mind, subjectively? What was my mind like when I felt that way toward this other person that I've already spent time cultivating that state of mind toward? And then we would use a remembering consciousness. Having already, as I mentioned before, we already have in our mind these seeds of compassion, these seeds of loving kindness. And we would try to use a remembering consciousness to recollect, when I feel this way toward other people, what kinds of thoughts arise, what kinds of feelings arise. And then we would try, even though it was kind of artificial, even though it was kind of not really truly genuinely felt, we would try to cause that to arise in our mind, even if it's really sort of in relation to our loved one. But we would try to project that onto this neutral person. Um, and we would try to also use some logic, some reasoning for why is this neutral person a valid object of my regarding them in this way. So we would think about how, well, just like my loved one, they deeply wish to be happy, they deeply wish to be free of suffering. And it isn't, we would recognize or try to recognize that it's not reasonable that I would withhold wishing for them to accomplish that goal simply because I don't know them very well, right? I know my loved one quite well. I've spent a lot of time with them. So I find it easy to hope for their well-being, but not having spent a lot of time with someone is not a good reason for withholding those kinds of well wishes. So we would use that kind of logic, that kind of way of arguing against the habit that we have of not really regarding them in the same way, to generate a different way of being able to relate to them. And so those are thoughts, those are conceptions that we rely on to get to a place where we've generalized, where we've expanded this way of relating to sentient beings out of loving kindness and compassion. And that is an example of analytical meditation. And analytical meditate, stabilizing meditation, we've given one example of a purely stabilizing meditation where we used the breath, the physical sensation that accompanies the in breath and the out breath as a purely stabilizing meditation. But stabilizing meditation also comes into play in an analytical meditation as well, because there does come a point in the analytical meditation where we've generated the intended object of that meditation. And in the example that I just gave, the intended object of that meditation is to feel some measure of loving kindness, compassion toward this neutral person, to be directing thoughts of well-being, thoughts of well-wishing, support in relation to this imagined neutral person in front of us. And so when we get to that point, of course, to get to that point, as I mentioned, we rely on various kinds of logic, various kinds of reasoning, various conceptuality. But then the meditation gets to a point where we feel subjectively this state of actually regarding them with that mind of loving kindness, that mind of well-wishing. And it's going, again, with all meditations, it's a long process of becoming repeatedly familiar to accomplish. And when that happens, then we don't really need to use those same chains of logic, those same reasonings. We can simply hold the loving kindness, the compassion in our mind and send it out, direct it out to this neutral person in front of us that we're imagining, right? And that's the stabilizing part of the analytical meditation. We don't have to continually use logic, use reasoning, use conceptuality. It becomes visceral, it becomes subjective, it becomes a state of mind that we simply abide in or rest in. So, an analytical meditation also has an aspect of a stabilizing meditation that is part of it as well. And within analytical meditation, the example that I just gave of loving kindness or compassion is one in which the goal is to generate the mind into a state of mind, the state of mind of compassion or generosity, or patience, or whatever it might be. There's a different kind of analytical meditation where it doesn't make sense to talk about it in terms of generating the mind of the object of meditation, like it does with patience or generosity or compassion or loving kindness. And this second type of analytical meditation is really more so in terms of like the wisdom teachings that the Buddha gave. So impermanence would be an example. So there's certain meditations, analytical meditations, where the goal is to generate the mind into a particular state of mind. There are other analytical meditations where the goal is to understand something about the nature of reality. And impermanence is an example of that, where, for example, so the word impermanent, just to be able to explain this example, the word impermanent itself, in relation to the Buddha's teachings, means that which changes moment by moment by moment. So we, as ordinary sentient beings, we don't easily um, we don't find it easy to relate to things through understanding them to be impermanent, right? We find it much easier to think of things as if they were permanent, as if, the things that we saw yesterday are the exact same things that we saw today. um, the chair in our living room, yesterday's living room chair and today's living room chair are the same exact thing. That would be grasping at that chair as if it was permanent, as if it wasn't changing moment by moment by moment. But it is changing moment by moment by moment, right? And so understanding that is, we're not trying to generate the mind into impermanence. Impermanence isn't a mental state. We're trying to recognize that everything is impermanent by its own nature, that characterizes everything that we interact with, everything that we relate to. Um, and, for example, to give another example, death is a consequence of impermanence, right? Our body is changing moment by moment by moment. And the consequence of that is that this body will die at some point. Not all things. In general, most of the things in our world, because they are impermanent, they will cease to perform the function that they are performing right now. Our computer, um, after 5 years, after 8 years, our computer will simply not turn on one day, right? We didn't drop it, we didn't, light it on fire, but it's impermanent, right? Just the cycles of turning it on, turning it off, the electricity moving through it. At a certain point, nothing particularly, dramatic happened, but because of its impermanent nature, it's not going to perform the function of a computer at a certain point. We'll go to turn it on and it won't turn on. And our body is the same. Our body will cease to be able to be a host to our consciousness because the body is aging and nothing dramatic has to happen to the body. But at a certain point in the future, the body will simply cease to perform that function. And then the mind will separate from that, from our body. And we call that death. So it's a consequence of the impermanent nature of the body. We're also not good at thinking about our own death. We also grasp at ourselves as being permanent, even though we wouldn't say it out loud. We wouldn't, tell people, "Oh, I'm going to live forever." But we're also pretty convinced every single day that we wake up that we won't die that day, and we're convinced the next day, and we're convinced the next day. So we pass our whole lives being convinced day by day that today is not our last day, which isn't really different than thinking that I definitely will never die, as a practical matter. So there are really good reasons why we would also use meditation to become familiar with the way that things are, which is a different kind of analytical meditation than is generating the mind into a constructive state of mind. It's more so developing our wisdom about how things exist, what is true about the nature of things. Um, so those are the three kinds of ways in which we use meditation. Sometimes we may do something that's purely stabilizing, like a bodily sensation. Sometimes we may use analytical meditation to cultivate loving kindness, compassion, generosity, patience, what have you. Other times we may use analytical meditation to develop a wisdom that understands the nature of things. So with regard to impermanence, we may really try to think about how it is true that things are changing moment by moment by moment. That is the nature of my body. That is the nature of my mind. That is the nature of everything in my environment, everything that I see and taste and touch. It is actually not static. It is actually not the same in any two moments. It is actually different from one moment to the next moment. And when I understand that, I suffer less, right? Because because things are impermanent, the impermanent nature of things will assert it themselves to us, really against our will, right? That, as I mentioned, the computer will just not turn on one day. And if we expect that things act as if they were permanent, then when the impermanent nature of things asserts itself to us, then we will be upset about it. And we will say, well, no, I'm grasping at this as if it was permanent. And therefore, that disconnect is going to cause me some discomfort. It's going to violate my expectation of just thinking of things as permanent. So that is a way to not suffer as much when we actually are confronted by the impermanent nature of things. And that makes a lot of sense, to try to come to terms with the way that things are, um, as it does also to use meditation to cultivate these constructive states of mind. So did that generate any thoughts or questions for anyone? No. Okay. So then we'll go into a different topic and we'll begin to talk about obstacles to meditation. There are 5 obstacles to meditation. We defined in the first class, we defined meditation as both a process and a skill. The skill of meditation can be defined. We talked briefly about this idea of calm, focused attention, being able to generate deep states of calm, focused attention. So of course, we can think of, as I mentioned, the process of meditation would be to just decide, okay, I'm going to do a session of meditation on generosity or breathing meditation. But if the mind is bouncing around, if the mind is dealing with a lot of distraction, a lot of agitation, then that particular session of meditation isn't going to be so powerful. If we can generate really deep states of calm, focused attention, then that same session, where the goal was to become deeply familiar with patience, with loving kindness, that will be a much more powerful meditation, and therefore will leave a much deeper imprint in the mind than a really distracted, sort of chaotic meditation where we were never really focused on the intended object, where we spent most of the meditation thinking about, what's happening later, what was happening before, rather than actually being absorbed in the intended object. So when we talk about that ultimate goal of meditation being um, truly being absorbed in the intended object, then there are these 5 obstacles that take us away from the skill of meditation. And the first of these five is laziness, right? So with laziness, really we're talking about an obstacle that arises before we really get going with meditation, before meditation or our practice of meditation really becomes a deeply ingrained habit. This is just not getting started. This is just finding it really difficult to find time in our day to even engage in any practice of meditation. So this is a primary obstacle at the very beginning, where we just don't feel like sitting down and actually putting time and energy and effort into the session. So um, yeah. So then the second obstacle, and so we'll talk about the obstacles and then we'll talk about things that we can do to counteract these obstacles. The second obstacle is called forgetting the object. So, with regard to forgetting the object, here, this is something that takes place within a session of meditation. And of course, this is all of these obstacles are totally normal, completely reasonable. Um, but forgetting the object just means that we are primarily moving into distraction, that the mind isn't absorbed in the intended object, that, we tell ourselves that we're going to meditate on compassion, but really we just think about work and we think about, our next meal and so on. And so with regard to forgetting the object, really the antidote is what they call recollecting the object, is mindfulness, is recollecting the object. So what this is getting at is that getting distracted is, of course, a completely normal part of the process. And the only thing that kind of the good news is that the only thing that we can do that's effective with regard to moving away from distraction toward calm, focused attention is to, as we did earlier, to give ourselves the instruction that when we notice that distraction has arisen, we return our attention back to the intended object. So we give ourselves an intended object, could be the breath, could be compassion, and then other things arise in the mind. And we simply notice that something other than the intended object has arisen in the mind, and we let go of that distraction and we bring back the intended object. And you just simply have to do that a lot over many, many sessions of meditation, over many, many months and years of having a consistent practice. And the mind itself gets with the program. The mind itself begins to understand what you are intending for it to do. It begins to simply stay on the intended object by itself under its own power through this process of noticing the arising of distraction and then returning again and again to the object. So there's nothing magical, there's nothing mystical, there's nothing unique about the process of moving from distraction to calm, focused attention. It's just understanding that meditation is different than anything else that we do in our day. It's different than reading a book, it's different than just thinking. We give ourselves the instruction to notice when the mind is not focused on the object, and we lift our awareness up from that distraction and we place it back on the intended object. And we do that as many times as we possibly can in every given session of meditation. Okay, so then the third obstacle is a pair of obstacles, and it's called mental excitation and mental dullness. And these are states of mind that give rise to different kinds of distraction. So, mental excitation is a very bright mind. It's a very active mind. It is a kind of, it is a mind that very easily moves from the intended object into other specific objects of awareness. So if we find that our mind is racing, that we can't hold the mind because we want to think about this, and then we want to think about this, and then we want to think about this, that's excitation. It's a very energetic mind. Whereas mental dullness is the opposite. So mental excitation is going to give rise to a whole succession of other kinds of mental objects. It's going to be like, oh, but I forgot to do this, and I need to do this, and then this is happening, and then what about this? Mental dullness is, as it says, is a very dull mind, a sleepy mind, a heavy mind. It is going to cause us to tend not toward these kind of ping-ponging off of a variety of objects, but it's really going to tend toward drowsiness. It's going to tend toward sleepiness, darkness, heaviness in the mind. And that's another kind of obstacle, right? Because even if it's just sleepiness or heaviness or dullness that's arising, that is not the intended object. It may not be that the mind is so bright, that the mind is so energetic that all of these other objects are arising, but it may just be that we're fighting against really just feeling alert, feeling sharp, feeling, really fixed on the object, and we really just want to take a nap. So these are two different ends of the sort of this spectrum of calm, focused attention. So the mind can either be too energetic, or the mind can be too relaxed, too dull, too sleepy. And really, in either way, fundamentally, we want to be vigilant. We've talked about introspective awareness. So doing something about, of course, even in the course of a single day, if we have multiple sessions, sometimes we'll be dealing with mental excitation, sometimes we'll be dealing with mental dullness. And we need to know which is arising. We need to have this introspective awareness that is cognizant of, am I having trouble staying on the object because so many other objects are presenting themselves to my mind? Or am I just really struggling to even remain focused at all? Am I really just withdrawing from the object, moving into a state of kind of vacuity or dullness? So we need to know, we need to know, do I need to bring my mind down, or do I need to bring my mind up? And so we have to have an awareness of actually what's happening in the mind. We need to either tighten or loosen the intensity of our awareness. So one way of dealing with excitation, there's several different specific things that we can do in relation to dullness or excitation. If there is a lot of excitation, we can simply move our mind back onto the breath. And we can try to, because the breath is a relatively easy object to develop concentration around. So we can simply try to hold our mind to the breath. We can take a little bit of a break and just focus on the physical sensations that are accompanying the in breath and the out breath, and try to really tightly attend to that for a minute or two to make the mind a little bit familiar with tightening down, with being more concentrated. Um, and then if we are another technique is we could, instead of, if that's not working or we want to try something else, we can do a little bit of a visualization technique for a minute or two in this meditation, where we visualize in the body. Inside the body, we would visualize the body perhaps as hollow, and we would visualize a very, very small seed or dot in the body. And we visualize this as energetic inside the body. The top half we would visualize as white, the bottom half as red. So, like the size of a mustard seed or a sesame seed or a grain of rice. Imagine this sort of dot in the body. Top half is white, bottom half is red. And we imagine bringing this small dot up through the body and sort of bringing it out through the top of the back of the head and kind of shooting it out into space. And then we would sort of regenerate it in the body and then bring it out again out through the top of the head. And we could do that for a minute or two. This is something that helps us to bring our attention to, from the Buddhist perspective, to bring our attention to the upper chakras, the upper energy systems or nexuses of the body. And that is something that can raise the energetic system of the body. So if dullness is arising, then we can do this to raise our energy level. If excitation is arising, then we can do the opposite. We can bring that, or we can just concentrate on that seed without moving it up. We can just concentrate on it at the level of the navel and hold our attention at the level of the navel on this seed inside the body. And we can do that for a couple of minutes. That will bring our energy down because it will kind of ground our awareness in relation to the lower chakras of the body. And that has a grounding effect on the kind of baseline energetic level of our mind. So those are three options, for dealing with excitation, dealing with dullness, stabilizing the mind. And again, based on the vigilance of knowing what is arising. Is excitation arising or is dullness arising? Another practical issue is what is happening in the body, because as I mentioned in the first class, it's very important to get in the habit of having good meditation posture. If our meditation posture has started to slip, that can very easily translate into dullness, right? If we, because we are developing this calm energy in the mind, if we then allow that to permeate the body and the body starts to slouch, the body starts to lean, then dullness can arise on the basis of that. Or if dullness is arising, then it's likely to influence the body in that direction. It's likely to, cause the body to lean or to slouch. And so becoming aware of, have I started to lean? Have I started to slouch? And then physically correcting that is something that can lead to or support having a more stable mind. Okay. Okay, so the next, so those are that's yes, Robbie, did you have a question? Did I see that you were unmuted, or did I not?
No, well, I just make a comment. I feel like
Yeah.
I have the fast moving mind like real early in the morning,
Mhm.
then later in the afternoon. Later in the afternoon, it's like the dull mind. So these are like the dull mind. I think is in some ways worse because I like catch myself like so calm and like really like yeah, I catch myself and I go, oh, I gotta kind of stop and like get back some energy or like I feel like my blood flow like stopped. So these are yeah, these are good techniques.
Yeah, definitely. And, we can also, if we notice that there are particular times of the day, like you said, you know, one reason could be we need to think about like, how am I sleeping? Am I not, because, or am I taking in caffeine, that's maybe too much or at the wrong time? Um, and we can do light kind of exercise to, before we meditate to, not anything too heavy, not, a major gym session, but, some yoga, some walking, some calisthenics, some light to kind of get a little bit of, energy back into the body, or maybe have a little bit of tea, maybe not a big, cup of coffee, but, a cup of tea, can certainly be helpful. So really becoming aware of patterns, as you said, these different patterns that arise. Is it always like this at a particular time? And also because maybe we just had a really stressful day, and so the mind is just sort of, is a little bit frazzled, too. But then recognizing that, well, my session of meditation is actually something that's going to be very restorative. So instead of, when the mind feels heavy, when the mind feels frazzled, not reaching for the remote and watching, but recognizing, well, after I do this 10 minutes of meditation, I'll feel, refreshed. And we can, think about it in that way too, seeing it as, something else that we can reach for instead of, kind of the normal things that we might reach for. Okay, so the next antidote, I'm sorry, so the next obstacle, these are things that really we don't have to worry about for us as beginners, but it's called non-application and over-application of the antidotes. And so for us, so I would say what we don't have to worry about really is over application. We may have to worry about non-application, because we we do need, as I said, we do need to recognize, is dullness arising, is mental excitation arising, and then what do I do about that? There is certainly a danger that we allow or we indulge in excitation or we indulge in excitement. And if we do that, of course, that's reasonable, but if we do that, that's non-application, right? That's just kind of like allowing the excitation to be there, allowing the dullness to be there, and not trying to fix it, not trying to maintain calm, focused attention. Um, but this idea of over application, that's really only applicable at very advanced stages of meditation. Um, and for that kind of meditator, what is happening is that for many years, they were dealing with pretty extreme um, distractions, right? The distractions were very powerful, very forceful. They were difficult to deal with. And so when they were responding to that, they were kind of forcefully, engaging in some response. And now, after many years of meditating, for this practitioner, what distractions are happening in the mind are pretty subtle, right? They require a very light touch to move the mind back. But there's a habit of being a little bit too forceful, kind of overcorrecting. And really this practitioner doesn't need those same approaches, but they have this habit, so they have to not engage in that habit. Um, but really, that's not something that is a danger for us. But non-application, is a danger for us, where we just think about, particularly with dullness, right? Because dullness can feel incredibly pleasant. It can feel like that the mind is just slipping into this really unfocused, calm state. But the meditation lacks any kind of clarity. It lacks any kind of sharp, wisdom focused on the intended object. And really, we're just like, oh, this is so enjoyable that I'm having this kind of dark or heavy or um, dull mind. We can mistake that for really the goal of having clear, sharp focus. And then that would be non application. We really want to make sure that the mind is, kind of in this middle ground where it's not so tight that the mind is moving to all kinds of objects, but also that it's not so dull that there's just a real lack of focus, a real kind of sense of dullness or heaviness in the mind. So non-application certainly can be something that we need to think about. Because if we want to make progress in meditation, we do have to see it as different than anything else that we do. It's, as I said, it's not reading, it's not just thinking, it's not just contemplating, it's not journaling. It's, we really have to get in the habit of picking the object of meditation and really thinking the purpose of this time is to become deeply familiar with this, which depends upon really trying to absorb the mind with clarity and with vibrancy into the object that we've chosen for that session. But of course, understanding too that it's a long process and distraction arises, and I need to be not indulging in that, not having an indulgent mind, but also not, rushing the process, not thinking, well, I can just, I've been meditating for a month. Why is distraction still arising? I've been meditating for a year. Why is distraction still arising? Of course, distraction is still arising. It isn't that that we're not tolerant of what's happening, but that when it happens, we just engage in the appropriate response. We engage in the appropriate antidote to what's arising. So, as I said, without feeling judgment, without feeling frustration, that distraction is arising. Okay, so we'll start to now talk about a different set of obstacles. And these are the 5 negative states of mind that are also obstacles to meditation. And so, what the problem with these is that when they arise in meditation, they're also responsible for bringing us out of being absorbed in the intended object. So, attachment is the first of these negative states of mind. So, attachment, or sometimes called craving or clinging, desirous attachment. What this is a very specific technical state of mind that the Buddha talked about. And what's happening here is that we are recollecting some object that we individually think of or regard as enjoyable, regard as pleasant. So, could be good food, could be spending time with a loved one, going to do some activity, something that we find pleasant, that we find enjoyable. And what's problematic about the way that we relate to these activities, um, is that we exaggerate what is pleasant about them, and we kind of feel like this activity is entirely pleasant, that it's sort of made out of happiness, that my happiness doesn't come from within my mind, but instead we think my happiness comes from my contact with these objects, that if we think about our life, we think that a happy life is a life that is spent mainly being able to be in contact with the people that we enjoy, the activities that we enjoy, the food and drink that we enjoy, and so on. That's what makes us happy. And so it's a mind that misunderstands the nature of our relationship with these objects, um, and gives away kind of our power to be content, to be happy, to be at ease within our own mind, and thinks, well, really, my happiness and my contentment and my ease is entirely defined by whether or not I'm contacting that object. And this is problematic for meditation because meditation is new, meditation is somewhat repetitive, and the mind isn't used to this framework because, again, the framework of meditation is one in which we are not indulging in distraction. A distraction arises, but we don't follow it, we don't intentionally indulge in it. And that's a new habit to be training the mind. And the mind kind of is used to, we've spent decades and decades indulging in distraction. When a particular thought arises, we just daydream about it, we just empower it, we create more story around it. We see no problem with that, because there isn't a problem with that in our daily life. But in a session of meditation, we're choosing not to engage in that process. So, what's going to happen? So, the mind is feeling kind of constrained by that framework. And so, what's going to happen is the thought's going to arise, well, I would rather be at the beach. I would rather be at dinner. I would, these pleasant things, we're not doing them, right? We're kind of constraining the mind, we're withdrawing the mind. So these objects of attachment are going to pop into the mind, and they're going to take us out of the attention on these chosen objects. They're going to be what, brings us out of that calm, focused attention to the intended object. So that is something that very naturally, very often, arises in our sessions of meditation. Okay. So that's the first of these these negative states of mind that that naturally will arise and will cause problems. The second, and the last one that we'll talk about today, is anger. And anger is on the opposite side of the same spectrum as attachment. Attachment is directed at things outside of oneself that oneself regards as pleasant. And on the basis of regarding as pleasant, one feels as though one's happiness is defined by being in contact with that which is pleasant. Anger is a mind that looks at certain other objects and views them as negative, views them as aversive, views them as not being responsible for one's happiness, but actually as being responsible for one's suffering, right? So when there's traffic, there's other people being unkind, there's injustices of various types, there's all kinds of things that we think, when I experience this, necessarily this object is going to cause me to be suffering by being in touch with it, by being in contact with it. And I want to be separated. I in fact need to be separated in order to be protected, in order to not experience suffering. The only way in which I can accomplish that is to physically or mentally be separated from these objects, that I think of in this exaggerated way. So attachment exaggerates pleasant objects, and anger exaggerates unpleasant objects. And they are both mistaken about the nature of the objects that they're exaggerating, right? There really aren't any objects that have the power from their side to make us happy. And there are no objects from their side that have the power to make us suffer, to make us unhappy. But, we feel as if that's when we don't have wisdom, when we don't really see things clearly, then we exaggerate in those ways. And we feel like I have no choice but to bring in these pleasant experiences and to be separated from these unpleasant experiences. And so, as we're trying to meditate, as the mind is, again, it's becoming more subtle, it's going inward, it's withdrawing, again, we're naturally going to replay, oh, I can't believe this person earlier today said this to me. How dare they? Because these are habits, right? We have the habit of being wanting to draw in that which is pleasant, and we have the habit of wanting to push out what is unpleasant. So unbidden, naturally, spontaneously, we're going to go to these really charged, these emotionally charged experiences. Some of these emotionally charged experiences will be pleasant objects, but some will be objects that are aversive, that are painful, that we want to be separated from. Um, and then that's also, we're going to ruminate on these experiences when we're trying to meditate, simply because in our daily life, we are deepening the habits of attachment, and we're deepening the habits of anger. We're using our lives to deepen these tendencies, these habits. And so naturally, they are very, very deeply ingrained in the mind, and they're going to just be what impacts our meditations. All right. So those, as I said, they're really two sides of the same coin, in the sense that um, anger is what happens in the mind when the mind of attachment isn't being satisfied. We want only pleasant things. And when we don't get pleasant things, then anger arises at those aversive objects. So it's two exaggerated and mistaken ways of relating to things. Um, and they're both going to cause trouble for us as we meditate, because they are so tied up with how we navigate the world. We navigate the world through the lenses of attachment and aversion. And so, as we're trying to calm the mind and train the mind and focus the mind is going to gravitate toward these very charged states. So those are the first two. We'll talk next week about the next three of these negative mental states as well, and how they negatively impact and why they negatively impact, and then some things that we can do about them when they arise. But did that trigger any thoughts or questions? All right, all right. So we will have our final class next week, and also Venerable Yuntin is here. She has a retreat also next weekend. If you're interested, as I mentioned before, the retreat is on um, establishing and deepening your meditation practice. So it's very timely, very related. That's Friday night is a public talk related to that, and then the main retreat is on the weekend, the third and the fourth, again on Zoom as well. But if there are no thoughts or questions, then we'll leave it here and pick it back up next week, or I can address any final thoughts or questions. Yep.
Did you? I missed last week, but did you guys talk about, or did you talk about like motivation to starting your session on the cushion?
Motivation in terms of like an altruistic motivation,
Yeah,
or
or just like I don't know, as like a basic. Sometimes I sit in with you in the mornings, and there's like a kind of like a basic. I don't know, is that the right word, but like prayer or like just a set of motivations of why we're doing this. That's kind of where I get tripped up when I'm doing it myself.
Hmm. So, I mean, so a person, I mean that it becomes a little bit more, advanced in terms of what a person's motivation is. It's perfectly fine, um, to have a variety of motivations. There isn't like a right motivation or a wrong motivation. Certainly, many people I think come to meditation, um, simply to feel better, to have more spaciousness in the mind, to be able to deal with anxiety or what have you, in a more skillful way, and that's all perfectly valid. So I mean, I think it's useful for a person to think about what their interest is. Um, in terms of the more advanced levels of motivation, that's not something that we've addressed because, again, this is about developing a person's practice on their own. So, whatever a person's genuine motivation actually is I think, perfectly valid. Um, if you are looking for kinds of like specific prayers or specific ways of thinking, there is a text. Um, if you, as I mentioned before, we are an FPMT center, a Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition. We are an affiliate of that international organization. So fpmt.org is their website. They have on fpmt.org, they have what they call the foundation store, and you can get a lot of different texts and things from them. There's a particular text called Daily Prayers that's available through the foundation store, and that will give you different kinds of short contemplations that you can use or you can read and think about in terms of setting a motivation that is a little bit more expansive or a little bit more focused on um, having as I said, an altruistic motivation, wanting, thinking about going beyond just what is in this for me, thinking about how, if I did develop, greater spaciousness of mind, more skillful ways of dealing with stress or anxiety or what have you, how would that impact others? How does that help me to be of value to those around me? That's certainly a maturation of motivation that I think is very useful over time. Um, but ultimately, I think that I do think that that maturation is something that happens, organically, naturally, spontaneously over time. And so, as I said, I don't think that there's a right or a wrong um, motivation for why a person is interested in their practice or having a practice. Um, from the Buddhist perspective, um, the the most altruistic or the most vast motivation that we can genuinely have is certainly best. So that's definitely something that a person can think about. I wouldn't, just generally what I would say is um, whatever a person's motivation is, in order to organically expand it, to begin really contemplating what, how, if I achieve those objectives, what is the advantage of that beyond just my own experience? And then that is something that will give you an entryway into having that be more expansive.
Awesome.
All right. All right. All right. So we will meet again next week. Take care. Have a great night.